Hopefully we'll see them at the midweek service. This morning I want to preach the sermon I said I would probably do on Wednesday night, and that is the three appearances of the Lord to Solomon. Solomon is one that we recognize had a great place given by God that he rose to very quickly by God helping him and giving him the very things that he needed. But along with that great rise of Solomon, there was great fall as well, because he failed to be obedient to the Lord as he should fully. What we want to look at this morning is the starting out of the first time of that appearance here first, and then go on and note the three appearances themselves. In 1 Kings chapter 3 and verses 1 through 5, the text says, "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord, and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in his statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night." That's the first time that it talks about this, and you notice something about Solomon here, that he is one who is already having some problems. There was the high place that they offered at Gibeon. That was one of a number, evidently. The people of Israel were ready to go to these high places and offer sacrifice, whether it be unto Jehovah or whether it be unto the false gods. It doesn't particularly say there. But here, Solomon is at least offering to Jehovah God at this high place Gibeon. You remember in the Old Testament law, it had pointed out specifically that they were not to have the high places as altars. As a matter of fact, there was to be no step up to the altar that was done. That was the way in which they sacrificed unto false gods. Idolatry was seen in that way. And as the people later on in the history returned to idolatry and failed to be with God, they came and they were ones who bowed down in service at the high places. And also it says under every green tree on the hills, that those places were known commonly for places of idolatry. But there are three appearances that show us about Solomon's movement away from the Lord. This first one takes place in chapter 3, the second one in chapter 9, and then the third in chapter 11. And we're going to go through those and notice the problems, how it came progressively for Solomon as he moved away from the Lord. The first one we notice is in 1 Kings chapter 3. Here, Solomon is seen as that humble king. Let's notice the text starting with verse 4. "Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, 'Ask what I shall give you.' Solomon said, 'You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given me a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? This speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked for this. And then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have you asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. The point of this is very clear. Solomon, as the humble servant, is coming to God, and he is asking God for that wisdom which was needed. He recognized the part that his father David had played in the kingdom. That David had served the Lord, that he had blessed him all the days of his life, and the Lord had given him blessings in return. As David was known as the friend of God, he had a heart that was given unto God. Solomon recognized this, and he saw that as the undergirding for all that he was to do, for being a right king. And that's exactly what God had pointed out too in his answer unto him. And so what happens? God blesses people that are humble. And you have that humility of Solomon recognized here. The point of the general principle of that is seen in James chapter 4 and in verse 6. It says, but he gives more grace, speaking of God. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That necessity of humility before God is needed. In Proverbs chapter 22, you recognize why it is that humility is what God associates with blessings. He says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. It's interesting to me in those things. Here Solomon, the writer of this, is pointing out the fact, or collector of the Psalms, or of the Proverbs, is pointing out the fact that what happened with him is what is a principle with God. The idea that here God gives riches, honor, and lengthened life to who? Not to the proud, but to the humble. And therefore the point is, since you've humbled yourself, Solomon, I'm going to give you all of these. I'm going to give you an extended life. I'm going to give you riches. I'm going to bring you the honor that's there as a king. Now, what happened if Solomon went away from that? We're going to notice that a little later. Those promises would be taken away in his way because he was not following the Lord as he should. In Matthew chapter 18, this point of humility is noted again, where here Jesus is talking to them, and he says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus had taught his disciples who were vying for the greatest part to be at his right hand in the kingdom. They were ones who were asking to be there as the next authority to be given. What did Jesus say to them? The least of you is the one that's the greatest. Whoever is the smallest, the one who humbles himself and sees himself as of little value, not having greatness, that's the one who God brings to greatness. He brings them to be exalted in their time. Also, we notice that Solomon in this prayer for wisdom is asking what was needed for the people. As he looks at the people, he says, they're without number, and I don't know how to judge them. I'm still a child. I'm not one who's able by my own, and he asks for wisdom. I want you to notice that with Ecclesiastes chapter 7. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7 also, a passage that's given to us through the hand of Solomon in his writing, says, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. Wisdom is needed among rulers in guidance more than the rulers themselves. It's that wisdom that causes them to be led in a proper way. In Proverbs chapter 2 and in verses 6 through 9, why is that so? It says, for the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth, come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. When you look at that idea, what is wisdom associated with? The wisdom of God is associated with that way of justice and right. And that's what God had told Solomon back in 1 Kings chapter 3. I'm giving you wisdom because that's the main thing that's needed for you to judge rightly among people and see justice. I want to call your attention to just one case in Solomon's life with that. Mother came and another mother, and they had made a deal to have their children to be eaten because they were in starvation. The one had been killed. And then they brought the other one, and the mother who had the first child, she's asking that now this woman won't give up her child to be eaten. So what does Solomon do? He isn't sure which is what, because each of them were saying, that's not her child, it's my child. So he asked one to come forth with a sword, and he said, you divide the child in two, you give half to each one. And what happened? The mother, who was the real mother of that child, said, no, you let that other woman have it. Now, justice was seen how? Through wisdom. And you see those kind of statements of Solomon, that he was able to judge over the people, rightly discern justice, because he's asking for wisdom, that being wisdom from God. In James chapter 3, we notice the same thing in the New Testament. It says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. What is wisdom that is from above? It's interesting here. The wisdom that is from above, he says, is first what? First pure. It's first that which is according to the will of God, according to his righteousness or justice. Now, with all of that good that was there with Solomon in this start, there's the beginning of his demise as well. He prayed at the high places. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings, it said, at those high places in Gibeon. That's against the will of God. Now, if these were those that were high places to be offered unto Jehovah, and I think that's what's so, if you look at the whole of the things with regard to Gibeon and go through Joshua and Judges and then through 1 and 2 Samuel and go to that point, you recognize that in Gibeon they were having a worship of God because there wasn't any place for there to be a temple that was set. After the tabernacle had been taken over and the Ark of the Covenant had been taken away because they used it as almost a good luck piece in battle, then it was brought back. It's Gibeon where that is all centered. You can do the right thing in worshiping God in a wrong way, and it's not acceptable to God. That's the point that is made here. They were worshiping God, but they were worshiping him at the high place in Gibeon, which was expressly forbidden in the Old Testament law. One doesn't make the other okay. You've done the right thing in worshiping God, offering to God, but the wrong place makes it that which is not acceptable to God. Well, let's look at that second time that God appears to Solomon. This is in 1 Kings chapter 9. In 1 Kings chapter 9, we have the occasion, the chapter before, of Solomon praying at the dedication of the temple. By this time, the temple has now been built. David had prepared the materials for the building of that house. God had pointed out to Solomon, this was what you're going to do. You're going to give this time of service to God in building this temple. David had charged him to continue on and get that to the very end and complete it. That's the problem that the people in the return, you remember, failed to do. That's exactly what they were rebuked about, is that they had started that temple, but they had failed to continue it. Now, here's what Solomon had done. He had finished that temple, but he hadn't finished all of his service to God. Look what it says. And it came to pass, when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all Solomon's desire, which he wanted to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in the integrity of your heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. As I promised David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given to them. And this house which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And as for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity on them. You see, the warning was there to Solomon that he had finished a part of the work. The fact was that the dedication of that temple had just been pointed out in the previous chapter, but that work of finishing the temple was not the only work that was necessary for him. He had done what God said in that building of the temple, but now he had more to do. And so what is done? What is done is that God warned him. If you do evil, it'll affect you and your leadership, and it'll affect the nation. You know, David needed to consider that seriously, because really in chapter 3, this had already started. He had taken the daughter of the Pharaoh to have her as his wife. Who were Israelites supposed to marry? Those are the people of Israel. Those who had faith in God. But the daughter of the Pharaoh did not have that faith in God. She was an idolater. And that sets the stage for what he continued to do. Throughout his lifetime, David took more and more wives and concubines, and they turned his heart away from the Lord. It points out very clearly. Now, what is God telling him here? You need to recognize what happens as a result of evil. He had told that to King Saul back in 1 Samuel chapter 15. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, you remember Saul, that's the one, King Saul, had failed to kill Agag. He had saved the best that was there. And all of these things, God had told him to utterly destroy it. And so he starts to offer because Samuel didn't come when he thought he should. And Samuel says to Saul in verse 22, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. God doesn't want what you give out of all of those things as though he somehow didn't have it and he's thankful for you giving all of these animals. He said what God wants, number one, is your obedience. You to follow the will of God. That's exactly what he tells Solomon later on. Now, how does that affect the nation? We all remember in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. There's a harm that's done when a people, a nation, start to go away from God. God will not tolerate it. He brings down and he brings up nations according to his will, and whether or not that nation follows him or is doing that which is right in his sight, is given to justice or inequity, that's something that's involved in the judgment of Almighty God. So what does this tell me? This tells me on the part of David, he's got a problem because he's not obeyed. And on the part of the people, they're also, not David, but Solomon, that he had not obeyed. And also on the part of the people, they're following what Solomon is doing. They're going in that other direction. And so there's a downfall that's ahead. Why? Because David failed to recognize, I'm not through with my service to God. If you go over to Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 6, there's a real simple point. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. You know, there's a saying I hear a lot today, and even among some of my brethren, and that is, well, I know that's wrong, but it's no big deal. It's not a big deal. Well, if it's against the will of God, it's a big deal. God has specified what he wants. What he desires is obedience, for us to do what he says. And if we don't, what does Ephesians 5 verse 6 say? Because of these things comes the wrath of God on the sons of disobedience. God was warning Solomon in this case, you need to stay with my will and obey. If you don't, there's going to be a problem. Well, when you think about that, what is going to constitute obedience? Obedience demands faithfulness to the end. Look at Hebrews chapter 3 and in verse 14. Hebrews 3 and verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast, note it, the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. There's faithfulness as defined by God. If we hold it fast all the way to the end. What did Solomon need to do? He needed to be faithful to God all the way to the end. There's no time to stop serving God. There's no time in which we can say, well, we've done a good job, therefore what we can do is do a little bit of bad now. That's not true. The service of God demands our steadfastness, our continued obedience in all things all the way to the end. That's God's will. Solomon failed to understand that. Solomon saw this big temple with its gold and all of these things, and he was amazed by that. Well, it was given by the grace of God, and the people had helped in that. It was a good achievement, but it wasn't the end of the achievement. He needed to continue and teach them, you need to look to God. What's being pointed out by that Shekinah, or that glory there that's within the Holy of Holies, is that God is with us. Not the person of God is here in our presence. He's in heaven, and Solomon had noted that in the prayer in 1 Kings 8. But what does it say? God is giving his symbolic presence here to say what? If you pray toward me, you accept me as Jehovah. You come to this place and ask blessings from me, and you follow my covenant and my ways, then what will happen? I'll bless you. They needed to remember that. That temple was something that was a memorial for them to understand God by. A memorial, when it's put out, does not take away the need for being obedient unto God. Indeed, the memorial serves to show that even more. You know, when somebody is trying to remember the death of Jesus Christ, his body and his blood in the Lord's Supper, and instead of thinking about that, is filing their nails or reading a book or talking with their neighbor or whatever else down the line, using whatever games they have on their phone, all of which I've seen when I've gone different places. They're saying, I'm partaking of the right thing. Why? It's the Lord's Supper. It's unleavened bread. It's fruit of the vine. We're doing this on the Lord's day. Therefore, we're right. No. That isn't all that's right. That's needed. But there needs to be in a memorial what? The remembrance of Jesus. The doing of what he says. That same thing goes for any matter. When we do what's right and we complete that which is right in one area, it does not take away our responsibility to do all else. Well, what happened with Solomon? What happened with Solomon is what's pointed out in 1 Kings 11 and in verse 6. I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible here. I like the way that it puts the Hebrew and gives the order, I think, in the way that really would be better. Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and unlike his father David, he did not remain loyal to the Lord. The New King James puts that, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. That idea is true, but this emphasizes the point. David had continued to follow God. Had he fallen from God? Yes, he did. But then what did he do? He got back up, he repented, and he gives us penitential psalms, which voice the very beauty of a heart that rends itself from evil and prays to God for the forgiveness. That heart that's penitent and lowly, that's what David had. But Solomon did not follow his father in that. And so what happened? We find the third appearance of the Lord to Solomon, the fallen and rejected Solomon. In 1 Kings 11 and in verse 9, so the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hands of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. We recognize historically that there were two tribes who came to him, but in that division, one that remained faithful, and that was Judah. That was it, that were there ready to serve God in God's way. Rehoboam, his son, became one who was lacking in wisdom. He followed every way of serving idolatry and other things, and therefore God said, because of your father David, I promised him to give you a full life in being king. But I'm going to take it from Rehoboam. You look at David, 40 years, Solomon, 40 years in service to God. But after him, those years diminish and they go up and down all over the place. And you don't have people that are giving themselves unto God anymore in the northern kingdom at all. They're fully involved in idolatry. By this time, Solomon had gained those other wives, as the start of the chapter pointed out. He had been one who had done that which was evil in God's sight by giving himself to follow the gods that they also served, and he had become that fallen, rejected Solomon. Let's notice something about him. God had warned him about this. It points out twice before he had warned him of that. Yet Solomon did what? He turned away from God. He disobeyed the commandments of God. Do you notice the parallel there? He turned his heart away from the Lord. How is that proven? By him disobeying God's commandments. I hear sometimes people say, well, we need to give our heart to the Lord, not necessarily do all those things that are said. That's not what God says. Both Old Testament and New, you have that very point being made, that God had noted the fact that the consequence of evil is that you're lost. You have a chance during this lifetime to serve God, to do what he says. But after that, we're not given a second chance to it. Evil or sin brings the rejection of God always. Look at that in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Here, the law was brought back to their minds in thinking about this particular fact. In Deuteronomy 28 and in verse 15, but it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully, now notice this, all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then in verse 16 and following, it starts to enumerate those curses. What did he say? You need to obey all that's there. Now, if you don't obey all, what does God say? I'll bring it all to you. It'll not be all the blessings, it'll be all the curses. And that's what you're going to receive. If we fail in obedience, then God's rejection is sure. In Romans chapter 1, Paul noted that with regard to what was taking place in the Gentile world. He goes through all these enumeration of sins, starting out with verse 18, dealing with the fact of their idolatry and making gods after their own desires, and the various other things that they had gone into. And then verse 32, Paul sums all that up by saying, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. In other words, not only the people who are engaged in doing the wrong, but those that are willing to have fellowship with those who are in wrong. Those who are going to approve of them that are against God. You see, Solomon started out by doing that. There were people going to the high places, no doubt, many of them, in service to false gods, idolatry. Solomon went at the beginning to Gibeon, not to worship a false god, but Jehovah God. But it started the way how that was done at the high places was wrong. Then what happened? He builds the temple. He does that which God said. But what happens? He starts to go away from God. God warns him again, you do that, you're going to be lost. But that's exactly what Solomon did anyway. I want you to notice something. In Hebrews chapter 2, there's a statement. If the people in Old Testament times were brought to be under the wrath of God by disobedience, Hebrews 2 and verse 1 starts out saying this, therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels prove steadfast, that's the Old Testament law of Moses, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward. You notice that? Under the Old Testament, who received a just reward of their evil? It was done for every transgression and disobedience received a just reward. Now let's look at it in the New Time. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? God also bearing witness, both with signs and wonders and various miracles, and gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. If they, under that Old Testament law, the Jews, if they did not have a mercy extended to them when they continued to disobey, had they come to what was right at the first? Yes. But then what happened? They left it. Now, how many times they left it is really irrelevant. The first time I decide in my heart, I'm not going to do what God says because I think something else is better or just as good, then what have I done? I've not given myself from the heart to God. That's the point made in Hebrews chapter 10 with regard to the idea of the gathering together, attending our assemblies. What happens when I don't do that? Now, you have some people say, well, it doesn't say just one time. Doesn't have to. It says that's what we do on the first day of the week. And when we fail to do that, what are we doing? We're failing to have a heart given to God to do all that he says. And the point of that is, how shall we escape if we do that? We won't. God will bring us into judgment on those things. You know, sometimes we hear people, my brethren, they say, oh no, we don't agree with Calvinism. We don't agree with the once saved, always saved doctrine. But then they act like they do. I don't know how many times I've talked to somebody about the need for them to be fully obedient as they should be. Say to them, you're not attending as you should. You need to really do that. And do you realize that I've been a member of church for 20 years? Do you know that my grandparents were ones that obeyed the gospel when they were just 20, and they raised my parents and they raised me? Well, that's real good. I know that David raised Solomon too. And David had a heart that was right to God, and I know that David was one ultimately who was right and saved before God, because the Bible tells me that. Solomon wasn't. He was at first. But he fell away from that, and he digressed. When I bring up how long I've been a member of the body of Christ, or how long I've heard the gospel, or who I heard it from, or maybe my dad is a preacher, that's not what matters. What matters is, what am I doing? And how will I escape the condemnation that comes if I fail to live right with God in all that is to be done? Well, you know what? There's some parallels that we see to Solomon in our time. It's real easy when we look at things, say, okay, I see that with Solomon, but the same thing happens today. For instance, when we look at today, we know that faithful congregations may turn from the truth. That's pointed out repeatedly. In the epistles, we have that point seen. You can't read the epistles without recognizing that there are some who turned away and are now rejected. Look at Romans starting out. There were some who were given to Judaizing teachers, and they're condemned by God. 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, it shows a panoply of all kinds of evil that was there. That wasn't what God accepted. The point was in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17, what should people do if they're in those congregations that are not following God? Come ye out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord. Pretty clear. Or you go through others and you notice the problems in Colossians, or in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, or in Hebrews, or in 1st and 2nd Peter, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. You go to the book of Revelation, and what you notice in chapters 2 and 3 is that you had 7 churches, only 2 of them are doing that fully, which God would have them to do. The rest of them are condemned. And in fact, pointed out that their condemnation is such that God is ready to cast them away forever if they're not going to return and do what's right. I don't know how many times I've seen congregations that at one time were splendid in their examples of faithful congregations standing for the truth. But now is not that way. What can I do? I can continue to do what Solomon was told to do. Follow God and not turn away. If I do, I'm going to be rejected as well. We've seen faithful elders and teachers that stray into error. In Acts chapter 20, we all know that Paul came to the elders there at Ephesus in Miletus, and he told them what it was that would happen among them. In Acts 20 and verse 28, therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God which he purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departure grievous wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And also from among your own selves men will rise up, speaking perverse things, and draw away the disciples after them. Watch therefore and remember that for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears. So now, brethren, I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you an inheritance among all those who are sanctified. What did Paul say? There are going to be those from among this number of people who are here. Your eldership, there are going to be some who depart from the faith. We know that's exactly what happened many times in New Testament times and in a couple of centuries after there. There was an apostasy, and it was led in many cases by those who were elders. Sometimes we have people telling us that really, if there's a problem in a congregation, I'm just a member. I'm going to follow the elders. What they say, they're in rulership. If God's going to take it out on somebody, he'll take it out on them, not me. I'm just going to follow them. Well, what happens about that? God also gave us a very clear mandate about what to do when those elders go away from truth. It says, do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may be in fear. That's what a sound congregation is going to do. When elders arise speaking perverse things, Acts 20, they're going to rise up and have the courage to have a plurality of people say, this is what's being taught and it's not right. And then what happens? That elder is put away from their midst. He's rebuked. As such, he's no longer blameless, can't serve as an elder. When people say, I'm just going to depend on the elders, that's not a biblical thought. That's a way into apostasy, and it's a way of the people who followed Solomon. Ever thought about that? There were some who surely would have said, well, the king's got to be right. We can do this. After all, he's the one who built the temple. But if they didn't follow what God said, they were lost, just like Solomon was. And finally, faithful brethren can be like Solomon in departing from the way of righteousness. You'll remember 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. You beware, Titus, because there are going to come along people who have itching ears. They're going to desire to hear things that are going to be acceptable to them. But what do? You preach the word. You stay true to the gospel. You don't turn aside to something else of what they desire. You know, I hear more and more of that as I go to various places, of people wanting the preacher to preach only to them smooth things. Peace, peace, when there is no peace. But what needs to be happening is we as faithful brethren need to be those who stand for that truth. And if error comes along among ourselves, then what happens? whether it's in a case of immorality, as in 1 Corinthians 5, or it's in a case of false teaching, as elsewhere is brought up in 1 Corinthians, we put that person away from among us. Why? Discipline is practiced in the church of God for a reason. It's something where we as individuals withdraw ourselves, have nothing to do with one who's fallen, for a reason. What is that reason? 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 says, don't count them as an enemy, but admonish them as a brother. 1 Corinthians 5, we deliver that one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the soul might be saved. If discipline is rightly done, it's done because we love the souls of men. We identify the wrong, we show that wrong, and we try to lovingly bring them back. Do you know what happens when there is no love there? Then what takes place is the Roman Catholic procedure, or the Amish procedure is used. And the idea is, we just excommunicate them. That's it. Just throw them away. Or how about the Amish? We're going to shun them. If they come back, we won't even turn to see them. I've been treated like that by some brethren. That's exactly what happens. That there's a refusal to even acknowledge your presence. What does that tell you? That tells you they have the wrong concept of what's meant, of trying to have a lovingly, brotherly awareness of the sin, bring it before that person and try to bring them back to the Lord. That's apostasy. When we do anything else, it's an involvement that acknowledges not our love, but our hatred toward those who are standing opposed to us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and in verse 12, the statement is made by the apostle, wherefore, or therefore, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. That's what I need to understand from the case of Solomon. I as an individual, those as elders, and congregations as a corporate entity can go away from the Lord. How do they do that? By not fully following what God said. You look at the life of Solomon and you see an exact way of how that can happen to churches, elders, or individual members. The lesson's yours. It may be if there's one that desires to come and be right with the Lord, whether in acknowledging Him initially or coming back to Him and coming through prayers for their sin, that they might be forgiven and have a right relationship with the Lord again. We can pray for